I think there are some real challenges we face to incorporate more real-world learning into our curriculum and pedagogy. One, I think, is the balance between what inherently is more unstructured experiential learning when you try and do real-world learning, with the more structured curriculum and pedagogies that we're so used to in conventional schools. Okay, and I think most of us who are educators know that assessment modes, for example, drive very much the way we teach. Yeah? So how do you actually deal with that balance? I think this is a really key problem that we face, even in Singapore.
During my teacher preparation program, I was exposed to a lot of different teachers. So I actually taught at a Boston public high school. I taught calculus and pre-calculus for several months. I also personally made it a point to visit other teachers' classrooms and sit and observe. And you know, I'd kind of ask the students, who's the good teacher? Who are the good teachers? Who are the bad teachers? And kind of observe what they did. And I came across several stories. One really powerful story for me was when a teacher told me that he knew a colleague who is a geometry teacher who used to hold his classes like a court case. And he would divide his class into 2 teams, and each team was to, he would project a diagram on the board. The diagram had, you know, shapes and lines and angles, and different values were given, and each team was to make a claim about the figure. So, you know, angle A is equal to 37 degrees, and prove it. And all the while, the other team is supposed to be pointing out flaws in the arguments. And I think that this type of a setup reflects a real-world situation, not just in the legal systems. This is something that happens over dinner tables and happens everywhere whenever you're trying to argue your point. And quite frankly, I don't see why my combinatorial analysis class that I'm taking right now can't be set up in the same way. It's proving. So, you know, I think that it's important when we talk about real-world learning that we don't only focus on changing necessarily the content of what we're learning, but also changing the process through which we learn that content.
Well, you've got a friend on Twitter who says, to me, real-world learning is not about the content in the main, it's about the effectiveness of learning.
Once you have a really rigid system, it's really difficult to start thinking about real-world learning or any of the new learning paradigms you're talking about, you know, creative thinking, problem solving, you know, research, etc. These are real values that you need to put into the educational system that the current system is not designed to, and it has very little entry points so that you can break this. You know, you need to invest in teacher education, you need to invest in curricula, you need to do so much, and the classical model, the way it's designed, is just not going to allow you to do the kind of changes that you're looking for.
Whereas in Paul's case, Paul, I think you'd be saying that your system has already shifted. You are down the road in terms of integrating more real-world learning into your current approaches.
And we're doing that because the system allows us to do that with technology.
Okay.
But you know, in a sense, I disagree with Marvin. I think you can just situate your approach depending on the environment and the ecosystem, basically,
yes,
in which your teaching learning is done. I gave the example of working with poor farmers. You know, now parts of China, Yunnan, I've been to really poor villages where the children study under the same conditions that we saw this morning. It's on the slides, you know, and yet the teachers have been innovative enough to bring the real-world issues into the classroom, okay? And then use basically the science to help illustrate certain principles. Yeah? And in the case I dealt with, many were rice-growing communities. You know, so they were teaching children life cycles, okay? And also food webs. You know, and how do you learn that? By going to the real world, bringing the real world into the classroom, looking at, I'm a biologist, looking at what are the predators, what are the prey, and so on, actually. And very powerful lessons. So it doesn't all the time require high tech, or ICT for that matter. Okay? It's understanding what the principles are, okay? And then applying those to particular real-world situations.
It seems to me that the problem is methodology as much as anything else. And I'd like to make 3 points about that, if I may. First of all, I think that many teachers are inhibitors of real-world learning because they're not in the real world. I think educators are often quite remote from the real world, particularly in terms of the world of work. The second point is that in my experience, and admittedly I'm going back a few years, many teachers used methodologies that they had experienced in the classroom themselves. So they were not using modern methodologies to teach modern children. And the third point is that once upon a time, it was a case of one size fits all. In other words, teacher methodology was based on a supply issue, not a demand issue. The modern world involves much more individual identity among the people who sit in classrooms and learn. So one size fits all simply doesn't work anymore, and I'm not sure if teacher education takes sufficient account of individual differences because they are really part of the real world.
We have to work with this system, the formal educational system. So we go out, we get the textbooks of the educational system, and we look at the intended learning outcomes section by section. This is something we're working on now. So we take the objectives of each lesson, and then we develop what we call learning objects or extended learning objects, and those learning objects address the same objectives required from the textbook, but we put in it problem solving, creative thinking, critical thinking, writing, real world learning. We integrate those elements into those learning objects. And then we take those learning objects and we give them to teachers to go teach in the classroom. So suddenly, we have a teacher now has a set of what we call learning objects. They include activities, resources, digital media. It could have a lot of digital media resources available all over. And then, most importantly, activities that allow the learner and the students to go and do something in the real world, to think, to write, to think of multidisciplinary work. We're no longer teaching, for example, science for the sake of science. You're teaching science for the sake of learning, for inquisition, etc. And so in this case, once you give this to a teacher, what happens, the teacher no longer needs to be the only source of knowledge and information and the driver. The teacher becomes a facilitator.
Singapore's seen some dramatic changes because we've jumped basically from a third world to a first world in one generation. So we've got lots of first world kids, but lots of third world mentality teachers. Teachers basically are at the center of any attempt to change curriculum and pedagogies and so on, really. And we're finding, like part of what I do in Singapore is trying to create situations where teachers who have been trained, you purposely use the word trained as teachers, let's say 10, 20 years ago, feel comfortable to deal with the new environment, which actually frightens some of them, okay? Now, it's a case where unless teachers are in a comfort zone, they're not going to try and innovate, including things like introducing real-world situations into the classroom. We found that we had to offer a lot of in-service courses for teachers whose comfort level was actually very low, to do collaborative learning, collaborative teaching, or to even do simple things like lesson studies, because they didn't have the confidence to do that. I think with the new teachers, people are like, no, I've got much more confidence that she can handle difficult situations. But it's the teachers who have been basically not exposed to some of the new approaches that are one of the most difficult groups of people to actually deal with, and yet we need them, basically. I think every system has those teachers. We can't afford to marginalize them.
People say that you can only have a good educational system if you have good teachers. We have to think of an alternative model where you can have a good educational system. You can possibly have a good educational system if you don't necessarily have good teachers. If you have good teachers, that will work for sure. I'm not saying that this is wrong, but I'm saying we have to think of a model where without good teachers, you can do something. You need to think of this model for the developing world. If you don't find such a model, it's hopeless.
There are 3 suggestions being made about how you can supplement and complement a core professional teaching force, particularly where you're challenged to have that quality and that quantity. One is technology, 2 is a more differentiated workforce. People are talking about paraprofessionals and others who can support. And 3 is that they say you need to play in the help of social entrepreneurs, not-for-profits, corporations, a range of others who can actually support learning.
Potentially, school is there and it's useful and it has its uses and there's assessment and you should be tested for proficiency. I certainly don't want a doctor that hasn't passed his biology courses. I don't think anyone here does either. But maybe there is room for creating programs that are outside of school, that are happening in people's garages or people's
The
basements.
blurred line between formal and informal.
Right.
Okay.
And if you see kids' interest in that, that's a statistic. If 80 kids are choosing to use their Saturday afternoon to go to a maker fair.
Yep. Let's see what the demand side does.